I was born December 19th, 1933 in London, England. My father had been lent by Magnavox Company to Big Ben Electric in London, and with great effort my mother had moved my sister and over to London on the boat, of course. And but it was a wonderful 3 years for my parents in London because they had close friends. His boss was a close friend, and they were wonderful to my parents there. And mother had a Danish au pair who lived in the house, who did everything. And the conversations that my parents had about the London years, I always knew that they were really special. But one interesting thing was it rained a great deal. And so, of course, there were no diapers in those days, and all laundry was always in the living room drying. And my father remembered that clearly. It was not what we have today, a laundromat kind of thing. So
A different kind of smell.
it was a different kind of world.
Now, how did your parents meet?
My parents met at Berkeley. My father's family lived in Berkeley, and there were 8 Dempsters at Berkeley, not simultaneously, but bang, bang, bang. They were all there during one period of time. And my mother, for some reason I don't quite understand, did her first year at SMU and then decided to move to Berkeley. And her major was Latin, and whether they didn't have Latin in Texas or what, I don't know. And the aunt and uncle that raised my mother actually came with her to take care of her because they didn't feel comfortable letting her go off by herself to Berkeley. And my mother became part of the Unitarian Church student group and met my father through that group. And their first memory of time together was at a tiny town in Marin County called Inverness, where the church group at Berkeley owned a house. And that was also the town where my father's mother and her 2 sisters had helped build a house on Tamales Bay that we now own. It was built in 1898, and it is right on the bay. And for 25 summers, my mother and I took my children up to Inverness, and that is where, in Tamales Bay, is where my parents' ashes both are, because it's a special place for us. When my father was growing up, there was a boat builder in town called um, 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 Brock, and my father and his 2 brothers tested the boats in Tamales Bay to see that they didn't sink. I don't know what their mother thought about that process, but that was what they did. And my father's family were not allowed to stay in this house because there were 10 maiden school teachers in this house, and therefore there were nobody that was married, and there were to be no children in the house. But they rented house after house, and as we would walk around Inverness, my father would say, "See that fence? My father built that fence. See that roof? My father put on that roof. See that road? My father built that road." And because my father knew every inch of this town and every single house in this town, and so it's made a special memory for my generation and certainly for my children's generation. When my oldest son was working in Hong Kong some years back, and he wrote to all of us and said, "I'm coming to California to see you all, and we'll all be at Inverness." So there were 12 of us at Inverness, and when after that happened, all the other kids came and spouses and what little children we had by that time. And I said, "Walter, at home I have 5 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms. And at Inverness I have 3 tiny bedrooms, 2 inadequate bathrooms, but there we were." And they had a wonderful time and they loved it. And they still go on a periodic basis to this place. So.
And is that one of the older buildings in Marin?
Yes, but every house in Inverness is old. There are very few new places in Inverness. They are maintained and taken care of by generations. But I do believe that we are the oldest family in town now. That I think that we are the oldest family. And we are a tiny house. The teachers didn't have much money. In fact, I looked up and my great aunt spent $10 for the land. And it is right on the bay. And there are two bigger lots to each side of us that have bigger houses. But we are this tiny one. But we're in a very prominent spot, and the house is yellow, so everybody knows where the house is. And we have a gardener who comes on a periodic basis to watch it, and the neighbors on each side watch our house for us. So it's
It sounds like your father built a sense of community around that house too.
he built a center community, and I had the only grandchildren in the family. My sister never married. She was very bright. She was a Stanford graduate too, and she worked for TRW and was the highest paid woman for TRW for many, many years in personnel. She had taught school for a period of time, an avid reader, and a very bright person. So my children, my 4 children, were the only grandchildren in my parents' family, and my father was very dedicated to teaching them how to hike and teaching them how to ride and teaching them how to swim and teaching them how to do everything outdoors as far as knowing geography and knowing everything. And we had every summer there was one child who was chairman, and at breakfast we had a family meeting each morning, and the chairman would call the meeting together, and we would vote about where we were going to go hike that day. And it was a big political game with my 4 kids about saying, well, we haven't been here, and it's not, the weather will be lovely here, and so forth. And one day my youngest, Karen, said, you didn't vote for my place. I'm not going today at all. and everybody just laughed at her because she did. And then we had a committee who fixed lunch and a committee who cleaned up the breakfast. And, we had a caper chart just like Girl Scouts. And we were very organized about who cooked dinner and who cleaned up dinner. And then every night we played cards after dinner together on the dining room table. So the house is still furnished with what the ladies did in the early 1900s. It still has the furniture.
So it's a time capsule
that came from their things. And then my great aunt Edna taught school for a period of time in Hawaii. So we have real tapa cloth on the walls, not paper. We have real tapa cloth on the walls, and we have some antique lamps that are there, and the bureaus were all brought from their San Francisco families' houses that are in the house. So it's a treasure indoors as well as the outdoors of this house. And I once brought, when I was cleaning up my mother's house in Santa Ana, I found some antique Japanese pitchers of coffee pitchers that had been at Inverness, and my mother had brought home for security. And when I called my son in Seattle and I said, what should I do with these? He said, you get those back to Inverness. So the kids all have this feeling of connection to this house because they went so many times, and it was very special. So
Now, what was your mother's and your father's name?
My father's name was Burgess Dempster. And as I say, he was born in Berkeley and lived in Berkeley. But he went to Berkeley, and his degree says mechanics, because they didn't know about electronics then. But that was his basic training. And his first job at Berkeley was chief engineer of Magnavox Company. That was his first job. And he started working actually in the San Francisco area, and then was sent to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and then was sent to London, and then was sent to Philadelphia, all with Magnavox Company. And then when the Second World War started, people of my father's training were not put into the military, but they were told where they were going to go and what they were going to do. So we went to Cincinnati, Ohio, and my father worked for Crosley Company and developed the proximity fuse, which was very influential in the Second World War. which not too many people really know about, but that was what he did. And it was a very difficult period of time because he was not allowed to say what he was doing at all. And
What was life like at home when he would come home from work?
no, he was not allowed to talk at home about what he was doing. It was all, a secretive kind of a project. And it was a very tense period of time because I remember one of his co-workers committed suicide. It was such a tense period of time that on men that were working in this kind of industry during the war. My father had to travel, no planes. He had to travel by train to Washington and to New York and to Boston a lot. And he loved to go to the New York terminal because they had wonderful clam chowder, and that was what he would love to tell us about, was clam chowder. And he finally got the recipe for that clam chowder, and I still can make that clam chowder because it was his special thing that he liked. But it was he sawed wood for to get his mind off what was happening, and I helped him saw wood. I would sit on the piece of wood, and when it fell, I would fall down, but that was part of the game, and that was I can remember that clearly. And my mother was born in Schenectady, New York, and her father worked for GE, and her father installed the first electric street lights in the United States.
Oh.
And she could remember when the electric lights would go out and her father would have to leave the dinner table to go do something about the new electric lights. And he was a musician, and a very fine musician, and he had a violin and a cello that he played. And my mother's family, my mother's mother's family, was not considered of the same class or the same wealth as her father's family. And so they were married for 2 years without letting anybody know about it because it was not proper that he was going to marry somebody. She was a beautiful woman. I have her picture on a bureau at my house. She was a beautiful woman, but she was lower class. And that was not, she hadn't been educated, and her father, her family was a working family. And that was a big issue in those days, kind of thing. But somebody came to visit who had tuberculosis, and she got tuberculosis, and she died when my mother was 5 because they didn't know what to do about tuberculosis. So her father, my mother's father, decided that my mother needed to be raised by somebody. So his sister had not been able to have children, and his sister's husband was building the railroads in New Mexico and in Arizona, the railroads between Texas and California. So my grandmother came on a train from El Paso to Vermont to pick up my mother, and took my mother by train clear across the United States, which you can just imagine what that must have been like when my mother was 5. And when my mother got there, she was terrified of the American Indians. She had never seen American Indians. She was terrified. So my grandmother actually taught her at home because was scared to go to school. It was something. But my grandparents did a wonderful job raising my mother. They had her playing the piano. I have a picture in my house of my mother playing the piano when she was about 6, and sitting at the piano. And her father was a very intelligent person, and saw that she played the piano and that she knew about gardening and she knew about a lot of things. My mother never talked about her mother because she didn't know her, that she had disappeared. So these grandparents took my mother, and then they ended up in Dallas. They were very active in their church, and my grandmother was a wonderful cook, and they had a little farm and raised vegetables and had chickens and did a very good job of my mother. And she did her first year at SMU, and then I really never knew why she changed to go to Berkeley, but she changed to go to Berkeley. And then, but she was very conscientious about the parents that raised her, and she wrote to my grandmother every day And my grandmother wrote to her every day. And I have stacks of these letters. And it's very interesting. You know, it's a lost art that we really don't have anymore, of communicating daily kind of activities of what you do. And I think it kind of made judgments and kind of steered people about, you know, what am I going to do today that I can tell my daughter, or what am I going to do today that I can say to my mother, whether it was cooking, whether it was canning, whether it was doing the laundry. I mean, you know, mundane things that housewives have to do. But also it was important that you saw people, that you visited with people, and you were able to relate what they had to say. And when my parents lived in London, I have one letter from my mother that says, "The boat came in, so I got your letter today." Hard concept for us to think about today when we go like this on our computer.
And within 5 seconds, the message is translated across the world.
The boat came in, so I got your letter today. So my parents lived a very interesting life, and partly because of the electronic industry, there was no electronic industry. When we lived in Philadelphia, our basement was filled with radios, and my father was taking those radios apart, putting them together, taking them apart, putting them together. It was just a fascination for him. My mother also ran a floral shop in our basement, and my mother also ran this Gilbert and Sullivan group in our house, so they were very busy. She had full-time help. She had someone who came every day to help clean and wash the clothes in the bathtub. That's hard for us to think about today.
Was that the Danish?
No, that wasn't the Danish. That was she was black, and she came in. Her name was Olive, and I can remember Olive serving me lunch all by myself in the dining room when I came back from kindergarten, because I could walk to school and walk home, and Mother would be off. But Mother had no car, and so she took the train, because there was a wonderful train service in Philadelphia that took you everywhere. And the first time I actually got on a train to go to Dallas to see my grandparents, I was very young. And that was, you know, I got accustomed to being on the train to go into Dallas, for that we would eat meals, and I learned how to spell Mississippi because the porter said, you know, well, you can't go across the river unless you know how to spell it. So I learned how to say Mississippi very rapidly when I was little. But the train going into Philadelphia from where we lived, when I got on that train, I said, well, where are we going to sleep? And my mother said, well, we're just going downtown. And I said, where are we going to eat? She said, well, we're not going to eat on this train. We're just going downtown. And then I said, well, what is this, a freight train? Because I wasn't accustomed to being on a train where I didn't have those services, you know, kind of to do. So, but when the war started, then my father really had no choice about, you know, he was told what he was going to do and where he was going to go. The moment the war was over, we were in the car to come to California. And with the dog and the cat and the goldfish, we came across the country. No air conditioning. It's hard for us to think about today, but no air conditioning. And we stopped to see national parks and see things to be educated as we came across the country. We bought a house in the Brentwood area, but there were still wartime regulations on the house. So the people had something to do with the movie industry, and they were protected in the house. And eventually my father arranged that they would pay us some money, because we lived downtown Los Angeles in the Gates Hotel for the better part of 1 year. And we were only allowed to stay there 5 nights because of wartime regulations. Our dog, cat, and goldfish were up in Carpinteria with my father's college roommate from Berkeley, who had a lemon ranch. So we spent many, many weekends in Carpinteria. Mother had to do the laundry, and that was where we went to do the laundry. And it was wonderful. My father helped in the lemon orchard, and he played tennis and then the adults played bridge at nighttime, and we got to go to the beach, and we dug up mussels, and we got to go watch the polo field. There was a wonderful polo field there with horses, and we got to go watch that. And in Santa Barbara, you know, they have a lot of pageants and things around the mission, and so we got to watch all that. So they were really very nice years. But we would leave the Los Angeles area after my father finished work. We ate at Clifton Cafeteria because it was the cheapest place to eat. And I only ate mashed potatoes for dinner because it was a game every night about who would eat for the least amount of money. We had no money, and it was a world very few people understand today about. There was no money. There was no money to do anything. And how my mother managed the laundry and managed doing that. She drove us from Los Angeles out to Westwood to go to school every day. There were no freeways. And she would sit and read a book and wait till the traffic went down. And what she did the rest of the day, I have no idea, because we had 2 rooms at the Gates Hotel, and they served us breakfast, and then we went out to some cafeteria for dinner. But it was a memorable time. And when we finally got the house in Brentwood, it was a nice house, and we were filled with movie stars around us, which was very interesting because a bus went down our street every day showing people where the movie stars lived. There was a whole new world for me, I'll tell you, because of clothes and dress and things that coming from the Midwest.
What was it like coming from Cincinnati wartime to Hollywood wartime?
Yeah, it was just a whole new world. You know, the girls were very well dressed at school, and my mother made all our clothes, and that was not, you know, it was just a very, very, you know, Elizabeth Taylor graduated from my high school, and I went to her graduation, and all the movie stars graduated from my high school. They had a school at the studios that taught them, but the graduation process was at the high school, at the public high school. So they would go, and you know, one of my friends, her family was in the movies, and she had this wonderful car, and so we got to go to some parties. And
what was her name?
Her name was Winnie Hetz, and I don't really know what's happened to her, and I don't even remember who it was in her family, but she had this wonderful old car and drove around. So, but I kind of found my life in the library at the high school. That was where, you know, I could deal with books and deal with things in that order. And I did have some friends. We had the YWCA kind of organized clubs and things, and they were really kind of like sororities. And the stylish girls were in stylish ones, and mine was not stylish at all. But I made some close friends within that group. We did have Japanese who were coming back from the camps, and they were not in my classes at all. And my son kind of accused me when he was doing my biography. He said, "What were you, prejudiced, Mother?" And I said, "Well, no, I have no idea. They were in PE with us, but it was because they didn't have much education in the camps, and they couldn't take the advanced placement courses, or they couldn't handle the math. So they had them in kind of specialized classes. And then we had University High School had a big kind of a valley kind of business, and we had a very large agricultural program in the high school of teaching the Japanese boys agriculture so they could be gardeners, which, you know, you look back on that now, it never would happen today.
Like Tanaka Farms that exist today.
Yeah, but that was how they handled them coming back from the camps. And
do you have any memorable experiences interacting with them while at school?
Well, if one of them was a football player or, you know, ran for student president, they were always elected. You know, it was kind of a reaction that if someone ran for student body president, as was Japanese, we elected them. That was considered the right thing to do, to elect them.
Why was it considered the right thing to do, do you think?
Just because, you know, we didn't want to be prejudiced, you know, that we didn't want to be discriminatory toward anybody. We didn't really have any Chicanos in our school at the time, which is very interesting now when you think about it, you know. But that was it. And my sister went off to Stanford, and so that was the only place that I applied to go to school. That doesn't happen today.
How much older was your sister than you?
My sister was 2.5 years older than I was, and she was very, very bright, and I wasn't very good at math, and I was always going to her saying, please help me with math, but what I really wanted her to do was do it. Don't help me, just do it. um, so it was a little tense because Stanford at that period of time would accept a few kids, and then if they didn't come, then they would accept a few more kids. And I wasn't first at my high school to be accepted. So it was, I remember my mother making phone calls and other people making phone calls to Stanford saying, what are you going to do with her? So I still have a little tiny piece of paper when my mother called the high school to say, you made it, that I got in.
Oh,
And going off to Stanford, I sent a trunk, and that was how you went in those days. And then I went with some family friends, and my father allowed me one suitcase to go. I was not allowed to take anything in a box or anything separate. I was allowed one suitcase. My dormitory again had movie stars' children and in it.
like who?
And at school, yes. Jack Betty's daughter was in my class, and there were other people that were in my class that came from very wealthy families and had a lot of clothes. And my roommate had 25 cashmere sweaters, and I had none. It took me a while to adjust, but I did. And it took me a while to learn how to handle Stanford, even though I had gone to a good high school. My first essay came back and said, this won't do. No grade, just this won't do. Shook me up. I thought I was going home for Thanksgiving permanently. But a good friend of mine in the dormitory down the way, she taught me how to write. And I would write something, and then she would say it again in a different way. And that was how I learned how to write. And if you can't write, you can't go to college. And that's the main thing that young people need to learn how to do is to write. So, and then I did become a sponsor, which meant that I was a junior and I lived in a freshman dorm, and I helped the 35 or whatever it was young women coming into school to learn the school songs and to learn about, we had girls' dormitories and boys' dormitories, and there were rules and regulations in the girls' dormitories about when you come home and that you were in things. And then they had to learn how to get along with kids from a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different nationalities. Not too many nationalities. We really only had 3 Asians in that class. That was all there were at that time. And one of them was in my corridor. And she came from the Valley area, and after the first quarter, she came into my room in tears, and she said, I have to go home. And I said, why? And she said, I didn't get all A's, and my father's not going to let me stay. So I called the parents to say, I'm sorry, we don't get A's at Stanford, and she needs to stay. That was a family that on the first day they also came. I was the authority that they saw, and they handed me cash of her tuition. And I said, no, don't give it to me. It wasn't nearly as much as what it is today, but still, that wasn't my job to collect the tuition in a business. Then I was a sponsor the second year too, but all the young men had to be in the military training at Stanford at that period of time, and all the colleges. There was really no choice.
What year was this?
It was, John graduated in 54 and I graduated in 55. So he entered there in 50. And the Korean War was still going on, and you were either in the military or you were in a military program in college. There was no choice. So he was obliged to do 3 years in the Navy after school. And he was going to be shipped overseas, and he said, we're getting married before I go. And it was very upsetting to my parents because I didn't have my degree. My father was livid, but I didn't have my degree, but it was what was happening. So I was married in January of 55, and he trotted overseas, and we lived in 7 different places in the United States while he was in the Navy. We lived in Berkeley and in Concord. We lived in San Diego. I lived at home for a period of time. And then the summer after I was supposed to graduate, he was overseas, and so my sister came and we went to summer school at Stanford. And I took some extra courses online, not online, but through some program that they had from Berkeley. So I got my degree in June 56, although it says 55. And my father came to graduation and he said, your degree is really more valuable than your sister's because you have 4 names on your degree and she only has 3. And the speaker was Herbert Hoover. And my father had never gotten to hear Herbert Hoover speak. So Herbert Hoover, of course, has a Hoover Library at Stanford that John and I have been very active with for many, many years. And so that made up for me not graduating when I was supposed to graduate. So I have my Stanford degree on the wall. Believe me, it was such a challenge to get.
But what was your major?
What my major was history. I was going to teach history. And it was a good major. There were some wonderful professors at Stanford in the history department at that time. But I had to take a lot of courses. I took a lot of English and other things.
Were there any courses that you were not allowed to take, being a woman, if you don't mind me asking?
No, Stanford's pretty
was pretty open
in that way. And my oldest son actually took advanced placement courses in the business school while he was there. And and then after we finished the Navy, John went to Harvard Law School, and we went back to Boston when I was 7.5 months pregnant, and my first child was born on his registration day at Harvard, in Mount Auburn Hospital, and the second one came 18 months later. So that's the way babies arrived in those days. They just arrived. But they were good years. They were nice years of living there.